My name is Scarlett Ravenswood. I'm 26 years old, and on the morning of my cousin's graduation party, my mother handed me an invoice. Not a card. Not a letter. An invoice. Printed on actual letterhead, itemized down to the last decimal point, totaling $157,000. The subject line at the top read, "The price of raising a failure." She didn't slide it under my door in private. She didn't mail it to my apartment. She waited until 43 members of our extended family were seated around the long tables in my grandmother's backyard in Fort Collins, Colorado, and she handed it to me in front of every single one of them. He smiled when she did it. That smile is the part one still think about. Not the document. Not the number. The smile. He thought I was going to fold. She thought I was going to do what I always did, press my lips together, blink back the burn behind my eyes, and quietly disappear into the background while she soaked up the sympathy. What she didn't know was that 3 days before that party, I had received a phone call. A phone call that changed everything I thought I understood about my own life. And what she really didn't know was that my grandmother, Eleanor Ravenswood, 74 years old, barely 5 feet tall, had already made a phone call of her own. Before I tell you what was in that invoice and what my grandmother's one phone call set into motion, I want to ask you something. If you've ever been the person in your family who was never quite good enough no matter how hard you tried, stay with me. This one's for you. And if you're new here and stories like this are the kind that keep you up at night because they hit a little too close to home, consider subscribing. I'll be here every time you need to feel less alone in it. Now let me take you back to the beginning because none of this makes sense without it. I grew up in Fort Collins, Colorado, which sounds idyllic, and in a lot of ways it was. Wide streets, mountain views, the kind of town where people leave their porch lights on and wave to their neighbors. Our house was on Clearfield Drive, a 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a tire swing in the backyard that my dad put up the summer I turned 6. From the outside we looked like the kind of family that had it together. My mother, Patricia Ravenswood, made sure of that. She was the woman every other woman in the neighborhood wanted to be. Elegant, composed, the kind of person who never raised her voice in public and always said the right thing at the right moment. Inside the house was a different story entirely. I have one sibling, my older brother Daniel, for years ahead of me, the golden child in every sense of the phrase. Daniel could do no wrong in our mother's eyes. His grades were celebrated. His friends were welcomed. His failures, and he had them, were reframed as learning experiences. Mine were just failures. I remember being 14 and bringing home a report card with a B+ in chemistry. I had worked myself into the ground for that grade. My teacher had even written a note in the margin saying I showed exceptional effort. My mother looked at the card, set it on the counter, and said, "Daniel got straight A's in chemistry." That was the whole conversation. That was most of my childhood in a single exchange. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I stopped needing that a long time ago. I'm telling you this because context matters, and the invoice my mother handed me at that party didn't come out of nowhere. It was the final act of something she had been building for years. I just didn't realize how deliberately she had been constructing it until everything came apart at once. After high school I left Fort Collins and moved to Denver. I enrolled in an accounting program at a community college because a 4-year university wasn't in the financial cards for me, or so I was told. What I know now is that my grandparents, Eleanor and the late Harold Ravenswood, had set up education accounts for both Daniel and me when we were children. Equal amounts. Same fund. Same intention. Daniel used his and graduated from the University of Colorado with 0 debt and a business degree. I graduated with $54,000 in student loans and a certificate I had earned by working 2 jobs simultaneously for 3 years. When I asked my mother once why my funds seemed to have run dry before I ever saw a cent of it, she told me the money had gone toward medical bills from a hospitalization I had as a child. She said it with such calm certainty that I believed her. I was 22. I trusted her. That was my first mistake, and it would not be my last. By the time I was 26, I had built something real out of what I had. I worked as a junior financial analyst at a mid-sized firm in Denver. I had my own apartment, a 1-bedroom in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, nothing glamorous, but the lease had my name on it and only my name. I paid my bills on time. I had a savings account I was genuinely proud of. I had a boyfriend named Theo, steady and kind, who used to say that watching me work was like watching someone refuse to drown. He meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. What I didn't have was any real relationship with my mother. We spoke on the phone maybe once a month. Obligatory calls mostly. She would ask surface questions, I would give surface answers, and we would hang up having exchanged nothing of actual substance. She had a talent for making me feel like a guest in my own family, tolerated but not really wanted, present but not quite seen. I had learned to manage that feeling by building walls high enough that her particular brand of criticism couldn't reach the parts of me that still bruised. Then my cousin Jessie graduated from Colorado State University, and everything I had so carefully managed came undone in a single afternoon. The party was held at my grandmother Eleanor's property on the eastern edge of Fort Collins, a sprawling ranch-style house with a big flat backyard that backed up against a stretch of open field. Eleanor had lived there for 30 years. It was the kind of place that held generations of memory in its walls, birthdays and holidays and Sunday dinners and at least one very loud Thanksgiving argument that nobody in the family ever fully recovered from. The plan, as far as I knew, was a casual celebration. Jessie had graduated with honors and the family wanted to mark it. 43 people had made the trip, aunts and uncles, cousins, their partners, a few family friends who had known us since before I was born. I had driven up from Denver that morning, arrived early, helped Eleanor set up the long folding tables in the backyard, carried chairs from the garage, arranged the coolers. That was my role in the family and I had played it so long I barely noticed anymore. I was the one who showed up early and stayed late and quietly made things happen while Daniel arrived with a six-pack and a loud entrance and got the applause. My mother arrived an hour before the party started. She looked immaculate. She always looked immaculate. She kissed Eleanor on both cheeks, complimented the setup I had spent 2 hours arranging, and then she found me near the drink table and she hugged me. It was a brief, performative hug, the kind that communicates nothing except that we are being watched and this is what appropriate mothers do. She said, "So glad you could make it, sweetie," like I was an acquaintance who had cleared her schedule as a favor. I said thank you for having me like I hadn't just carried 40 chairs across a gravel driveway. And then the party began and for the first 2 hours, everything was fine. People ate, people laughed, someone brought a cake shaped like a graduation cap that Eleanor said was the most ridiculous thing she had ever seen and then ate 2 pieces of. Jessie made a speech that was equal parts sincere and embarrassing, which was perfect. I sat at the end of a table with Theo and let myself relax into something that almost felt like a normal family afternoon. And then my mother stood up. She tapped her glass with a spoon, and the backyard went quiet and she smiled that smile and she reached into the bag beside her chair and she pulled out a manila envelope and she walked the length of the table toward me, and the floor of my stomach dropped before she even opened her mouth. She stopped beside my chair. She placed the envelope on the table in front of me. She said, "I have something I've been meaning to give you for a long time, Scarlett." Her voice was warm. Practiced warm. The kind of warm that has an audience in mind. I looked at the envelope. My name was typed on the front. Not handwritten. Typed. I should have known then. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single printed document, 3 pages stapled in the corner. At the top in clean professional font were the words, "Invoice. Payable to Patricia Ravenswood. Payable by Scarlett Ravenswood. Total amount due, $157,000. The itemization began on the second line. Hospital delivery costs. Infant formula first year. Clothing, ages 0 through 18. Private piano lessons she had made me quit after 6 months. A school field trip to Washington, D.C. that I still remembered as the best week of my childhood. On it went line after line, 26 years of my existence reduced to a column of numbers with a total at the bottom and a due date of 30 days from today. The price of raising a failure, it read at the top just below the word invoice in bold. I raised my eyes from the document. 43 people were watching me. Some looked confused. Some looked uncomfortable. A few, I noticed, were already looking at my mother with an expression I couldn't quite name. My grandmother Eleanor, seated at the far end of the table, was very still. Her hands were flat on the tablecloth. Her eyes were on me. And for a reason I would not understand until later, she did not look surprised. Nobody moved. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I replay that moment in my head. 43 people and not one of them moved. Not to comfort me, not to challenge her, not even to refill a drink or shift in their seat. The whole backyard had gone the kind of quiet that only happens when something crosses a line so far that the air itself seems to hold still. My mother remained standing beside my chair, hands clasped in front of her, the picture of patient dignity. Like she had just presented me with a gift and was waiting for the thank you. I set the invoice down on the table. I smoothed the edge of it with my thumb just to give my hand something to do. Then I looked up at her and I said, "Where did you get letterhead?" She blinked. The question clearly wasn't what she had prepared for. I said it again, calm as I could manage. "You printed this on actual letterhead." "Whose letterhead is this?" Someone at the far end of the table let out a short, involuntary laugh and immediately swallowed it. My mother's composure flickered just for a half second and then she reset it. "This is not a joke, Scarlett." "I know it isn't," I said. "I'm the one holding a bill for my own childhood." I set the papers face up on the table so the people nearest to me could read the header. "The price of raising a failure." I watched two of my aunts lean in to read it. I watched their expressions shift from curiosity to something harder. My mother had miscalculated something fundamental in the planning of this moment. She had imagined I would cry. She had built the whole performance around the assumption that I would shrink, that the public setting would amplify my humiliation rather than expose her cruelty. What she had not planned for was the possibility that 43 people, given a clear enough view, might look at that document and feel something closer to disgust than sympathy. My Uncle Raymond, my dad's older brother, spoke first. He was a quiet man, not someone who inserted himself into family drama, but he looked at the invoice and then looked at Patricia and said, "Linda, what is this?" Her name was Patricia, not Linda, and the fact that he used the wrong name in his agitation made the moment feel even more unraveling than it already was. She corrected him sharply and he waved his hand like that wasn't the point, because it wasn't. My grandmother Eleanor still hadn't moved from her seat at the far end of the table. Her hands were flat on the cloth and her eyes were steady on my face, and I noticed that she wasn't looking at my mother at all. Not even glancing at her. Later I would understand why. Later I would understand that Eleanor had already decided before the party started, before the invoice came out of the envelope, before any of us sat down to eat, that she was completely done watching this happen to me. But I didn't know that yet. What I knew in that moment was that I had a choice. I could fold the way I had always folded, absorb the humiliation quietly and spend the drive home to Denver crying in my car while my mother spent the rest of the afternoon reframing herself as the long-suffering parent of a difficult and ungrateful child. Or I could do what I had been quietly, carefully preparing to do for the past 8 months, ever since a routine credit check at my firm had turned up something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor of my office chair. I reached into my bag. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I had expected them to shake. Instead there was a strange calm that settled over me, the kind that arrives when you have already fully accepted that the hard thing is about to happen and there is no version of the next 5 minutes that doesn't change everything. I pulled out a folder. Brown, plain, the kind you buy in bulk from an office supply store. I had labeled it in black marker with a single word: documentation. I set it on the table beside the invoice, and my mother's eyes dropped to it immediately and stayed there. "Patricia," I said, and I used her first name deliberately because I needed her to understand I was not speaking to her as her daughter in this moment. I was speaking to her as someone who had spent the last 8 months doing exactly what I was trained to do for a living. "I work in finance. You've used that against me before, told people I only care about numbers, told people I have no warmth. But the thing about working in finance is that you learn how to follow a paper trail. And I have been following yours for a long time." She started to say something. I kept talking. The table was quiet again, but differently now. Before it had been the silence of shock. This was the silence of attention. People were leaning in without quite realizing it. I opened the folder and took out the first document, a bank transfer record printed and highlighted in yellow. 8 months ago I explained I ran a personal audit. I do it every year, tracking my credit, my accounts, my full financial footprint. This time I found something I had never seen before. A series of credit accounts tied to my social security number that I had never opened. 3 accounts, opened between 2019 and 2021. I never applied for them. I never received a single statement, because the mailing address registered on all 3 was not my apartment in Denver. It was a P.O. box registered to Patricia Ravenswood at the Fort Collins Postal Annex on Riverside Avenue. The collective breath that moved through the table at that moment was almost inaudible. Almost. My mother opened her mouth. I held up one hand. The 3 accounts had a combined original balance of $38,000, I continued. By the time I found them, 2 had been partially paid down. But the damage to my credit file was already done. I had been rejected for a car loan in 2021. I had been flagged twice during apartment applications. I had spent the better part of 6 months on the phone with creditors, trying to understand why my score had dropped 60 points when nothing in my financial behavior had changed. He knew why. He had to have known. The purchase history on those accounts did not reflect my life in Denver. It reflected someone else's life entirely. Home furnishings, kitchen renovation materials, landscaping services billed to a Clearfield Drive property address. I let that last detail land before I said anything else because I watched the people around that table do the math themselves. My Aunt Carol was the first one to say it out loud. Her voice was completely flat. "Those are the same countertops," she said. She was staring at the purchase printout. "Patricia put those in 2 springs ago. I helped her pick the stone. I was there when the contractor came to measure." The murmur that moved around the table after that was fast and low, the sound of years of accepted family history being quietly re-examined. My mother drew herself up and said, in the most composed voice she could still access, "You are all seeing a fraction of a very complicated situation." She swept her eyes around the table the way she always did when she needed to reclaim a room. "Scarlett has always had a gift for framing things in the most damaging light possible, and if you knew the full story you would understand. I've resented this family," I repeated, keeping my tone even. "That's your explanation. Mom, I drove 2 hours this morning to carry chairs and set tables for a party you walked into as a guest." Aunt Margot, seated 2 places down from my mother, said nothing. She simply stood, picked up her glass and moved to the empty table behind her. The gesture was quiet and it was devastating, and it said everything she had decided not to put into words. What I had just shown them was serious. Identity theft tied to a close family member always is. But the credit accounts and the renovation charges, as damaging as they were not the deepest thing in that folder. There was one more document I hadn't touched yet. I had been holding it back deliberately, not out of hesitation, but because timing matters when the truth is large enough to crack a family clean in two. That document didn't have anything to do with money or credit scores or kitchen renovations. It had to do with something my mother had kept sealed for 26 years, something she had built an entire version of herself around protecting. She had spent my whole life making sure I would never have the credibility to be believed if I ever got close to it. The irony was that her invoice, the one she had printed and framed as a weapon, had given me the audience and the opening she never intended to hand me. I closed the folder. I looked at her across the table. She was watching me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger. Not contempt. Something quieter and more frightened than either of those. She knew there was more. And she knew she had no idea how much I actually had. My brother Daniel had not said a single word since the invoice came out of the envelope. He was 3 seats down from me, jaw tight, eyes moving between the folder and my mother's face. I glanced at him once and caught something in his expression that I filed away for later because I didn't have the bandwidth to deal with it in that moment. It looked like recognition. The specific kind that happens when a detail you stored somewhere quietly suddenly connects to something you didn't know was related. I would find out what he knew. But that conversation belonged to a different part of this story, one that hadn't started yet. Right now I had one more document to show 43 people. And I was about to open it. The last document in the folder was a single sheet of paper. No charts, no spreadsheets, no highlighted columns of numbers. Just a printed email chain, 3 messages long, the kind of thing that looks completely ordinary until you read what it actually says. I had printed it on plain white paper 8 months ago, the same night I found the fraudulent credit accounts, because once I started pulling the thread on my mother's financial activity, it led somewhere I hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. I had sat alone at my kitchen table in Denver for 2 hours after reading it the first time. Theo had been asleep in the other room. I hadn't woken him. There are things you need to hold by yourself for a while before you can hand them to someone else. I had held this one for 8 months. I was done holding it now. I pulled the sheet from the folder and I didn't pass it around the table. Instead I read it out loud. My mother's face went completely still the moment I unfolded it. She recognized it. I could tell by the way her eyes fixed on the paper without moving, the way a person goes still when they see something they thought was gone forever suddenly reappear in a room. The email was sent from an account registered to Patricia Ravenswood. The recipient was a woman named Donna Hale, my mother's college roommate, someone I had met maybe twice in my life at family Christmas parties. The date on the first message was March 4, 2021. My mother had written 4 sentences. I'm going to do something at the family gathering this summer. I need you to be my character witness if things go sideways with Scarlett. You know what she's like. She'll try to make me the villain. Donna's reply came 6 minutes later. What are you planning? My mother's response, sent at 11:42 that night, was the one that mattered. I'm documenting everything I've ever spent on her and presenting it formally. If she pushes back, I'll tell everyone she's been unstable for years. I have enough people who'll back me up. I just need one more. The table was completely silent. I folded the paper. What that email told everyone sitting there wasn't just that my mother had planned the invoice in advance. It told them she had also planned what to do if I fought back. She had a script. She had recruited backup. She had been building a case against my credibility long before she handed me that envelope. The humiliation wasn't an impulse. It was a project. The first person to speak was my Aunt Margot, who had already moved her chair to the other table. She said from across the yard, "You planned this." It wasn't a question. My mother turned toward her. "Margot, you don't understand the full picture." "I understand enough of it," Margot said. She had her arms crossed and her voice was the kind of quiet that carries more weight than shouting. "You recruited Donna Hale to call your own daughter unstable in front of the family if she defended herself. That's not a mother protecting her family. That's a woman running a campaign." My cousin Jesse, who had been sitting at the edge of the gathering looking like he genuinely wished he could disappear into the lawn furniture, stood up at that point and walked inside without a word. I didn't blame him. This was supposed to be his afternoon, and instead it had become something none of us would forget for the rest of our lives. My Uncle Raymond had his phone out. He was reading something on the screen, and the expression on his face told me he was cross-referencing what I had just read against something he already knew or suspected. He looked up at my mother with an expression I can only describe as the slow withdrawal of 30 years of goodwill. "Patricia," he said carefully, "has Donna Hale been telling people at the Briar Falls Community Board that Scarlett has mental health issues?" My mother said nothing. The silence was its own answer. I hadn't known about the community board. That was new information landing on top of everything else, and I filed it away because there was still something more important I hadn't said yet. I looked at my brother Daniel. He had been a statue for the past 10 minutes, jaw set, eyes on the table in front of him. I said his name. He looked up. I said, "I need to ask you something directly and I need you to answer me honestly in front of everyone here." He nodded once, barely perceptible. "Did you know about the credit accounts?" His jaw tightened. He was quiet for long enough that the answer was already clear before he spoke. "I found out about one of them about a year ago," he said. His voice was low. "I confronted Mom privately. She told me it was a mistake with the bank and she was handling it. I believed her. I should have told you." The admission landed differently than I expected. I had braced for a denial, for him to defend her the way he always defended her. Instead he was sitting in the same open air of accountability that the rest of us were breathing, and he looked like a man who had been carrying a smaller version of the same guilt I had carried for years. "I'm not ready to tell you it's okay," I said. "But I hear you." He nodded again. He didn't ask for more than that. My mother had been watching this exchange with the particular alertness of someone calculating whether there's still a move available to them. There wasn't, but she made one anyway. She straightened in her chair, set her hands flat on the table and said, with remarkable composure given everything that had just happened, "I want everyone here to understand that I raised Scarlett alone for 3 years after her father left the first time. I sacrificed opportunities, relationships, and my own financial stability to give her everything she needed." She paused for effect. "The debt she's describing, the accounts, I made mistakes, yes, but I made them trying to keep this family above water." My grandmother Eleanor moved. It was the first time she had shifted in her seat since the invoice came out, and the stillness she broke was so complete that every head at the table turned toward her. Eleanor rose from her chair slowly, the way she always moved, with the deliberate, unhurried authority of someone who has never needed to rush to be heard. She was 74 years old and she had not said a single word for the past 40 minutes, and the silence she had kept made what she said next land with the force of something that had been building for a very long time. "Patricia," she said. Her voice was steady and utterly without warmth. "You did not raise Scarlett alone for 3 years. I did." Her eyes held my mother's without blinking. "When you left Fort Collins in 2001, Scarlett was 18 months old. You left her with Harold and me for 11 months while you went to Phoenix. We didn't call it abandonment because you were family and we loved you. But that's what it was. The air around the table changed in a way I can't fully describe. It got heavier and clearer at the same time, the way it does right before a storm breaks. I had not known the specific details of what Eleanor had just said. I had known pieces of it, fragments my father had mentioned over the years that my mother had always reframed as a period of personal difficulty, a time she needed to find herself. 11 months. 18 months old. I had been a baby left with my grandparents for nearly a year while my mother went to Arizona. Eleanor continued. I have watched you treat this child as a burden since the day you came back from Phoenix. I have swallowed my concerns for 24 years because I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere between a mother and her daughter. She paused. I was wrong to do that. I should have said something a long time ago. My mother's composure finally broke in a way that was different from the controlled displays she had been managing all afternoon. Her eyes filled with genuine tears, not the kind she performed when she needed sympathy, the real kind that come when a person realizes they have lost something they cannot negotiate back. Mama, please, she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said, I need to make a phone call. She picked up her phone from the table, walked across the backyard through the screen door and into the house. The door swung shut behind her. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute after that. The afternoon had grown long, the sun dropping low behind the tree line at the back of Eleanor's property. And the light had that particular late-day quality that makes everything look both sharper and sadder than it actually is. I sat in it and let the quiet settle around me. Theo reached under the table and found my hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Around us, people were beginning to move, some gathering plates, some pulling out their phones, some just sitting with the particular stillness of people who have witnessed something they will spend years trying to find the right words for. My mother was still at the table. She had her hands pressed against her face and her shoulders were shaking. My Aunt Carol sat 2 chairs away from her and did not move to comfort her. I watched that too. I didn't know yet what phone call Eleanor was making inside that house. I didn't know who she was calling or what she was setting in motion or how far the consequences of this afternoon were going to reach beyond the backyard where we were all still sitting. What I knew was that my grandmother had kept a very specific silence for a very long time. And whatever she was doing on the other side of that screen door, she had been waiting to do it for years. Eleanor was inside for 19 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my phone without meaning to, the way you do when you're waiting for something and your brain needs a number to hold on to. The backyard had thinned out considerably by the time she came back through the screen door. Maybe 20 people remained, the ones who either lived close enough that leaving felt rude or cared enough about me to stay. My mother had moved from the table to one of the porch chairs, sitting alone with a glass of water she hadn't touched. Daniel was beside me now, having quietly relocated sometime during the 19 minutes. He didn't say anything. He just sat there and I let him because whatever complicated thing existed between us, he had chosen a side by moving his chair and that meant something even if I wasn't ready to say so out loud. Eleanor came back through the door and crossed the yard toward me with purpose. Not rushing, never rushing, but directed. She pulled out the chair across from me, sat down and set her phone face down on the table. I made a phone call, she said, as if 19 minutes of the most loaded silence I had ever sat in needed no acknowledgement. I told her I gathered. She looked at me carefully, the way she had looked at me since I was a child, like she was reading something underneath the surface of my face. I called Martin Ellery, she said. He's been our family attorney for 22 years. She folded her hands on the table. I told him everything. I told him about the education fund, the credit accounts, the invoice, the email you read aloud. I asked him to open a formal file tonight. My chest tightened. Tonight? She nodded. He's already drafting a fraud referral to send to the Larimer County DA's office in the morning. I want it on record before your mother has time to move anything or call anyone. I stared at her. Eleanor, you don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, she said, her voice carrying that particular note of finality that meant the decision had already been made and this was simply the announcement. I want to. There's a difference. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers for exactly 2 seconds, firm and warm, and then she sat back. There's something else, she said. She told me about the education fund first, the part one hadn't fully known. When my grandfather Harold was alive, they had set up 2 equal accounts for Daniel and me, $40,000 each, intended to cover the bulk of a state school education. Harold had passed away in 2017. Eleanor had assumed the accounts transferred according to the trust documents. She had never been given a reason to check. It was Martin Ellery on the phone 19 minutes ago, who told her that the account designated for me had been redirected through a secondary authorization form in 2018, a form bearing a signature Eleanor said she did not recognize when Martin described its particulars. The money had been transferred in 2 installments to an account she had never seen before. $40,000. Gone 18 months before I graduated with $54,000 in student loan debt. I had known the fund existed. I had known it ran dry. I had not known it had been redirected through a forged authorization. That was the part that sat differently. Not because it changed the financial reality I had already been living, but because it meant the theft hadn't been impulsive or situational. It had required planning. It had required a signature that wasn't Eleanor's. Someone had known how the trust was structured and had moved deliberately to get ahead of it. I looked across the yard at my mother still sitting alone on the porch. She was watching us. She had been watching us since Eleanor sat down. She couldn't hear what we were saying, but she could see Eleanor's face, and whatever she read there had made her very still in the way of a person who knows the net is closing and is trying to calculate whether there's still a gap. Daniel, sitting beside me, had gone rigid when Eleanor mentioned the forged signature. I turned to look at him. He was staring at the table. "Daniel," I said quietly. He closed his eyes for a moment. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. He said it to the table, not to me. His voice was flat and controlled in the way of someone reciting something they've rehearsed because the unrehearsed version would come apart. "About 2 years ago, Mom asked me to witness a document. She told me it was related to the property taxes on Grandma's house, some kind of administrative update. I signed where she pointed. I didn't read it closely." He finally looked up at me. "I think that was the authorization form." The yard was very quiet. I heard a car passing on the road at the front of the property, and it sounded absurdly normal against everything else. Eleanor was watching Daniel with an expression I couldn't entirely read, something that held sadness and recognition and an exhausted kind of grief for time already spent. She said, "Daniel, I need you to write that down, everything you remember, the date, what she told you, what you signed." He nodded without speaking. I didn't say anything to him for a long moment. Then I said, "You didn't know what you were signing." He said, "I should have asked." I said, "Yes." He said, "I know." We left it there. Some things need to be said plainly and then set down. My mother made her move about 10 minutes after that. She came off the porch and crossed the yard toward Eleanor, not toward me, which told me she had already written me off as a negotiating partner and was going straight to the source. "Mama," she said, standing at the edge of the table. Her voice had been reconstructed into something softer, the register she used when she wanted to appeal rather than perform. "I know today went badly. I know I made mistakes and I know how this looks." Her eyes moved to Eleanor's face. "But you've known me for 51 years. You know who I am underneath all of this. You know I love my family." Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long moment without speaking. When she finally responded, her voice was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. "I know who you've been trying to be for 51 years, she said. "That's not the same thing. Patricia, you stole from your own child. You forged my name on a legal document. You opened fraudulent accounts using Scarlett's identity and used the money to renovate your kitchen." She paused. "And then you printed an invoice calling her a failure and handed it to her in front of this entire family." She tilted her head slightly. "What exactly do you want me to say to that?" My mother's reconstructed softness cracked at the seams. She said, "I want you to remember that she's not perfect either. She's made this family uncomfortable for years with her attitude and her distance and her need to be the victim in every situation." Eleanor said quietly, "Which specific situation would you like to start with? Because I have been paying attention for a long time and I would genuinely like to hear your answer." My mother had no answer. She stood at the edge of the table for another few seconds, then turned and walked back to the porch. She didn't come back to the yard after that. What happened over the next several hours was less dramatic than the afternoon had been, but in some ways it was more significant because it was the part where people made permanent choices. My Aunt Margot came to find me near the end of the evening while Theo was helping Eleanor carry chairs back to the garage. She sat beside me on the back steps and she said, "I want you to know that I've been watching your mother treat you this way for 15 years and I said nothing, and that was a failure on my part." She didn't dress it up or explain it away. She just said it plainly and waited. I told her I appreciated her saying it. She asked if there was anything she could do now and I said, Honestly, just don't let her rewrite this when she starts calling people next week. Margot looked at me with something fierce in her face. She said she won't get very far. Uncle Raymond had already left, but he sent me a text message that I read while sitting on those steps. It said 4 words. I believe you, Scarlett. 4 words from a man who had known my mother for 30 years, and they meant more than the longer messages that came later. By 9 o'clock, Eleanor's yard was empty except for the 2 of us and Theo. The tables had been folded and stacked. The lights strung along the fence were still on, orange and warm in the early dark. Eleanor brought out 3 glasses of iced tea and sat with us on the porch steps, and we didn't talk about my mother or the invoice or Martin Ellery or any of it. We talked about Harold, her late husband, and my grandfather, and Eleanor told a story about him getting lost on a camping trip in Rocky Mountain National Park in 1987 that made all 3 of us laugh until the tension of the day finally, genuinely broke. I drove back to Denver that night with Theo quiet beside me and the windows down and the highway dark and open ahead. My hands were steady on the wheel. My mother hadn't texted or called. I hadn't expected her to. What I hadn't expected was the feeling that settled over me somewhere on that drive, somewhere between Fort Collins and Denver, somewhere in the dark between who I had been that morning and whoever I was going to be now. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief exactly. It was the specific sensation of a weight being set down after you have carried it so long you forgot it wasn't part of your body. 3 weeks after the party, the Larimer County DA's office opened a formal investigation. Martin Ellery called me on a Tuesday morning while I was at my desk in Denver, and he walked me through it in the methodical, unhurried way of someone who had been practicing law long enough to know that the people on the other end of these calls need clarity more than they need comfort. The investigation would cover 3 areas. The fraudulent credit accounts opened in my name, the forged authorization form used to redirect my education fund, and a separate matter that Martin said Eleanor had specifically requested be included, a pattern of financial misrepresentation spanning several years. He told me I didn't need to do anything immediately except make myself available if the investigators needed a statement. He told me Eleanor had already given hers. I asked him how she had sounded when she gave it. He paused for a moment and then said, like someone who had been waiting to tell the truth for a very long time. I thanked him and sat at my desk for a while after we hung up, watching the city outside my window and thinking about how long certain things take to finally move. My mother called me 4 times in the 2 weeks following the party. I didn't answer. She left one voicemail, a long one which I listened to once and then saved without responding to. Her voice on the recording moved through several different versions of itself inside of 4 minutes. It started measured and reasonable, the voice of a woman presenting herself as misunderstood. Then it shifted into something more wounded, the register of a person who believes their suffering is being unfairly ignored. By the end it had landed somewhere rawer and less controlled, not quite the real thing but closer to it than anything I had heard from her in years. She said she had made mistakes. She said she had been under enormous financial pressure for a long time and had made decisions she wasn't proud of. She said she hoped I could find it in my heart to have a conversation before things went any further. She did not apologize. She got close to it twice and then pulled back both times, which told me everything I needed to know about where she actually was with it. I didn't call her back. That wasn't cruelty. It was just clarity about what a conversation would and wouldn't be able to do at that particular moment, and I had learned by then to trust my own read on those things. Daniel called me 10 days after the party. That one I answered. We talked for 2 hours, which was longer than Daniel and I had spoken in a single conversation in years, possibly ever. He told me things about our childhood that I hadn't known, not because he had been hiding them but because we had grown up in the same house and managed somehow to have almost entirely separate experiences of it. He told me about the specific ways our mother had kept us divided from each other, the small strategic things, the way she relayed information between us slightly distorted, the way she positioned his achievements and mine as competing rather than parallel, the way she had made it seem for years like I resented him personally when what I actually resented was the system she had built around us both. He didn't say any of this to excuse himself for the authorization form or for knowing about the credit account and staying quiet. He said it because he thought I deserved to understand the whole shape of what had been done, not just the parts that touched me directly. I told him I needed more time before I could say where things stood between us. He said he understood and that he wasn't going anywhere. We hung up and I made dinner and I thought about the word divided for a long time afterward, about what it means to grow up in the same house as someone and still end up on opposite sides of a story neither of you fully wrote. The piece of news I wasn't prepared for came on an ordinary Wednesday, 6 weeks after the party. I was at Eleanor's house for one of the visits that had become a quiet weekly habit, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee and a plate of the shortbread she made from a recipe that had been in the family for 40 years. She told me without preamble that she had amended her estate documents. She said it the way she said most important things, plainly, without theater, as if the weight of the information could carry itself without any help from her delivery. She had removed my mother as the primary beneficiary of the Fort Collins property. The house and the surrounding land, which had been in the Ravenswood family since 1974, would pass directly to me. I set my coffee cup down. "Honor," I said. She held up one hand, the same gesture I had used at the party to stop my mother from interrupting, and I recognized it and almost smiled. "This is not a reaction to last month," she said. "I've been thinking about this property for 2 years. I just needed to be sure." She looked at me steadily. "I'm sure." I told her I didn't know what to say. She said that was fine and pushed the shortbread closer to me. We didn't discuss it further that afternoon. Some decisions don't need a lot of words around them. They just need to be made and then honored. My mother found out about the estate change 11 days later through her own attorney, whom she had apparently retained sometime in the weeks following the party. She showed up at Eleanor's house unannounced on a Saturday morning. I wasn't there, but Eleanor told me about it that evening on the phone, with the kind of spare precision she used when she wanted me to have the facts without the performance. My mother had arrived at 9 in the morning. She had stood on the porch and told Eleanor she was making a decision based on emotion and temporary conflict and that she would regret it. Eleanor had listened to all of it standing in the open doorway without inviting her inside. When my mother finished, Eleanor said 3 things. She said she had made the decision calmly and over a period of time and it was not temporary. She said she wished Patricia well and meant that genuinely. And then she said, "I think you should go now." My mother left. Eleanor said she had watched her walk to her car from the front window and that she had looked smaller than she expected, which I understood, because that's what happens when the version of yourself you've been maintaining finally costs more than you have left to spend on it. 2 months after the party I got a letter. Actual letter, handwritten, in an envelope with a Denver return address I didn't recognize. The handwriting on the envelope was careful and slightly formal, the kind of script that belongs to someone who learned to write in an era when penmanship was still taught deliberately. Inside was a single page. The writer introduced herself as a woman named Frances, 63 years old, who had worked with my mother at an insurance company in Fort Collins in the early 2000s. She had seen something about the investigation through a mutual acquaintance and she wanted me to know that she had witnessed my mother open a credit account in what she described as someone else's name during a lunch break in 2019. She hadn't understood what she was seeing at the time. She understood it now. She included her phone number and said she had already called Martin Ellery's office that morning. I sat with that letter for a long time. Not because it changed the legal situation, Martin already had more than enough, but because of what it represented. A stranger who had carried a small strange memory for years and finally understood what it meant and decided to do something about it. I wrote her back. I thanked her. I meant it. Theo asked me once, about 3 months out from everything, whether I felt like I had one. We were walking along the Cherry Creek Trail in Denver early morning, the kind of late summer day where the air still has some cool in it before the heat sets in. I thought about the question seriously before I answered because it deserved a serious answer. I told him I didn't think winning was the right frame for it. Winning implies the other person loses, and what had actually happened was more complicated than that. My mother had lost things, yes. Her relationship with Eleanor, her standing in the family, her version of the story she had told everyone including herself for 26 years. But I hadn't gained those things. What I had gained was different. I had my credit file back, clean and accurate. I had my education fund acknowledged and a civil claim in progress that Martin said was straightforward. I had Eleanor's kitchen table every Wednesday and shortbread from a 40-year-old recipe. I had Daniel, cautiously, carefully, across a distance that was closing slowly but genuinely. I had Theo beside me on a trail in the morning with the city waking up around us. I told him the thing that felt most true was that I had stopped organizing my life around a person who had never been able to see me clearly, and that the space that opened up when I did that was bigger and quieter and more mine than anything I had expected. He said that sounded like enough. I said it was more than enough. We kept walking. The morning held. If any part of this story sat with you tonight, if you have ever been the one in your family who carried the weight of someone else's choices while being called the problem, I want you to hear this. The story they told about you is not the truth of you. The invoice they handed you in whatever form it took was never about your worth. It was about their fear. You are not what they called you. And the life waiting for you on the other side of their version of your story is yours to build exactly as you choose. I'm Scarlett Ravenswood. And I am nobody's failure. 14 months. That's how much time passed between the afternoon in Eleanor's backyard and the day I'm sitting here telling you the rest of it. 14 months sounds like enough time for things to settle, and in some ways it is. The investigation concluded. The family rebuilt itself into a different shape. Eleanor's property is still standing on the eastern edge of Fort Collins with its flat backyard and its fence lights and its kitchen table that has held more honest conversations in the past year than it held in the decade before. But 14 months is also not that long when you're measuring it against 26 years. Some things move faster than you expect. Some things move slower. And some things surprise you entirely by arriving when you least need them and turning out to matter more than you thought they would. The investigation took 8 months from the point of formal referral to resolution. Martin Ellery kept me updated at every stage with the same measured calm he had used in that first phone call. The kind of professional steadiness that stops being impersonal after a while and starts feeling like its own form of care. My mother was formally charged in month 4 with 2 counts of identity theft, 1 count of financial fraud, and 1 count of filing a falsified legal document, the authorization form Daniel had unwittingly signed. She retained an attorney. There were negotiations. There was a period of several weeks where Martin told me the outcome could go in multiple directions and I needed to be prepared for the possibility that a trial would be necessary. I sat with that possibility for those weeks and discovered that I was more prepared for it than I had expected. I had already said everything I needed to say in Eleanor's backyard. A courtroom would have just been a different room. In the end, there was no trial. My mother accepted a plea agreement in month 7. Community service, restitution, and a period of supervised probation. The restitution covered the redirected education fund in full and a portion of the damages from the fraudulent credit accounts. It was not a dramatic outcome. It did not feel like a movie ending. It felt like a bureaucratic process arriving at a conclusion, which is mostly what justice actually looks like up close, and I had made my peace with that distinction long before the agreement was signed. What I had not made my peace with, and what took considerably longer than 8 months to even begin processing, was the question of who my mother actually was underneath everything she had done. I don't mean that as an excuse for her. I mean it as a genuine question I found myself sitting with in the quieter months that followed, usually late at night when the apartment was still and Theo was asleep and the city outside made its low ambient sound. There is a version of my mother that existed before I was born. A version that was young and scared and making decisions she didn't have the tools to handle well. I know that version existed because Eleanor told me about her, in pieces, over Wednesday afternoons at the kitchen table. She told me about a woman who had grown up in a house with her own difficult mother, who had never been taught that love wasn't conditional, who had spent her whole adult life trying to control the narrative of her family because it was the only way she knew how to feel safe. I didn't find that information comforting exactly, but I found it clarifying. It didn't change what she had done. It just gave the shape of it a context I hadn't had before, and context, even painful context, is almost always better than the absence of it. Daniel and I have dinner once a month now. We started in the winter, when the days are short in Denver and the mountains sit white on the horizon and the city feels smaller and more contained than it does in summer. Our first dinner was at a Vietnamese place near my apartment that he chose because he knew I liked it, which meant he had been paying attention to something about me for longer than I had realized. We talked for 3 hours. We didn't resolve everything in that dinner or the one after it or the several that followed. What we did was establish a habit of showing up, which is maybe the most important thing 2 people can do when they're trying to build something that was never properly built in the first place. He's still figuring out his own relationship to what happened, his own accounting of what he knew and when he knew it and what he chose to do with that knowledge. That's his work, not mine. I don't carry it for him. But I show up for the dinners and he shows up for the dinners, and so far that has been enough to build on. The Fort Collins property became mine officially on a Thursday in early spring. Eleanor called me that morning at 7 before I left for work and told me the paperwork had finalized. She sounded pleased in the restrained way she had when things went according to her intentions. I asked her if she was absolutely certain for the last time, the way I had asked her 4 or 5 times over the preceding months. She said, "Scarlett, I have been certain since before I picked up the phone to call Martin Ellery. Please stop asking me that." I laughed, the first real laugh I had managed before 8 in the morning in a long time. I drove up to Fort Collins that weekend and sat in the backyard on one of the folding chairs from the garage, the same chairs I had carried across the gravel driveway 14 months earlier, and I looked at the flat stretch of yard and the open field behind it and the fence with its lights not yet turned on in the afternoon, and I tried to locate some feeling large enough to match the moment. What arrived instead was something quieter. A sense of continuity. That this land had held generations of people before me and would hold them after me, and that I was now part of that line in a way that nobody could invoice or redirect or take back. That felt like enough. Felt like more than enough. Theo proposed on a Saturday morning in April. Not a grand gesture, no reservations or orchestrated moments. We were in the kitchen making breakfast and he asked me in the middle of cracking an egg, which is exactly the kind of proposal that suits us. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We are not in a hurry to plan anything. We are in a hurry to keep living the life we have already been building, which is honestly a better foundation for a wedding than any amount of elaborate preparation. Eleanor cried when we told her, which was the most emotionally demonstrative I have ever seen her in my life, and she immediately composed herself and offered us shortbread as if the tears had not happened, which made Theo love her instantly and completely. I saw my mother once in those 14 months. It was not planned. I was in Fort Collins for a weekend in October, working on some repairs at the property with a contractor Eleanor had recommended, and I stopped at a grocery store on the way back to Denver for supplies I needed. She was in the produce section. We saw each other at the same moment. There was a beat, maybe 3 seconds long, where neither of us moved or spoke. She looked different. Not diminished exactly, but quieter. Like someone who has stopped performing and hasn't yet figured out who they are without the performance. He said my name. I said hello. We stood there for a moment in the particular awkward geography of people who share an enormous history and no current language for it. Then she said, "You look well." I said, "I am well." And that was everything. She moved toward the vegetables. I moved toward the exit. I sat in my car in the parking lot for about 5 minutes afterward, not crying, not upset, just locating myself in the moment the way you do when something lands differently than you expected. I had expected it to feel like more. Like a confrontation or a wound or at minimum a wave of something complicated and hard to name. What it actually felt like was the closing of a parenthesis. A sentence that had been open for 26 years, finally punctuated. Not with anything dramatic. Just with a period and a breath and the ordinary sound of the world continuing. I am 28 years old now. I own a piece of land in Fort Collins that has been in my family for 50 years. I have a career I built from scratch and a credit score I earned honestly and a brother I am slowly learning to know and a grandmother who calls every Wednesday without fail and a man who proposed in the middle of cracking an egg. I have a life that is entirely, unambiguously mine. My mother sent me an invoice 14 months ago for $157,000. She labeled it the price of raising a failure. I have thought about that label more times than I can count in the months since, and what I keep coming back to is this. She was trying to put a number on my worth, the way people do when they need to diminish something they can't control. But worth doesn't work that way. You cannot invoice it. You cannot redirect it into a different account. You cannot open a fraudulent line of credit against it and pay for your kitchen renovation with it. It belongs to you and it accrues on its own terms, and nobody, no matter how long they have been trying, can take the balance from you. I'm Scarlett Ravenswood. The bill was never mine to pay. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.